June 12th, 1849. Charleston awoke in its usual splendor. Church bells rang across the red-tiled rooftops. Hooves clattered over cobblestones while street vendors called out their wares. Silver bright fish fresh from the harbor, green vegetables from the countryside, golden pastries heavy with butter. Barefoot children laughed, clutching sweets, their voices rising through the damp morning mist. It was a scene painted in warm colors, a portrait of Southern prosperity. Yet only a few streets away, inside the Holloway mansion, breakfast would turn into the overture of a tragedy. The dining hall glittered under a chandelier, light bouncing across crystal and polished silver, laid out in perfect rows upon a snow-white cloth. At the head of the table sat Thomas Holloway, a corpulent planter who liked to call himself Charleston's gentleman. He lifted a cup of steaming black coffee with pompous ease. To his right, Eleanor, slim and poised, sipped mint tea with the grace of a ritual. To his left, James, their 22-year-old son, admired his oiled hair in a silver mirror as he bit into an egg. They looked like a portrait of abundance. But in Thomas's coffee, in Eleanor's tea, in James's oatmeal, there lurked a powder invisible to the eye, crushed oleander leaves, the silent killer hidden beneath sweetness. Behind the curtain of kitchen smoke stood Rebecca Turner. For 20 years she had labored for this family with calloused hands, lowered eyes, and a voice so quiet it seemed erased from the air. To the Holloways she was nothing but part of the furniture of the kitchen, an invisible shadow among pots and firewood. But inside that silence, she had carried memories too heavy to vanish. Memories of her brother whipped bloody and hung in the yard. Memories of kin sold away in wagons, swallowed by distance. And the cruelest memory of all, that Thomas Holloway, the man seated so proudly at the head of the table, was her own father, who had never once spoken her name. Every memory Rebecca had ground down like dried leaves, tucked away in jars of spice. And on this morning, all of them had been poured into breakfast. At first, the signs were faint. Thomas frowned at his coffee. "Why is it so bitter today?" Eleanor set down her teacup with a delicate shiver. "There's a strange taste." James paid no attention, spooning more porridge, even joking. "Thick and rich, just the way I like it." Minutes later, the illusion shattered. Thomas clutched his chest, gasping. Eleanor's hands shook. Porcelain shattered against the floorboards. James collapsed in spasms, choking as the poison twisted through him. The elegant room erupted into chaos. Cutlery clattered, chairs overturned, voices shrieked. Within the hour, three figures who once believed themselves untouchable lay lifeless across their own table. Outside, Charleston bustled on, men haggling over cotton prices, women laughing at market stalls, unaware that only streets away, an execution had been carried out without jury or judge. The kitchen fire that once nourished had become Rebecca's tribunal. Judgment wasn't written in ink, but stirred into the food with oleander dust. The wooden spoon she had wielded for decades was no longer an instrument of service, but the gavel of sentence. They say the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Rebecca proved the way to send a man from this world travels the same path. She did not scream, did not weep, did not smile. She only cleared the broken plates with a calm that froze the air. In that moment, she was no longer the silent cook. They saw her as a judge cloaked in flame and poison, passing sentence in a language older than any law. This was not merely 3 deaths. It was a declaration. The silence of the enslaved was not submission, but fire banked under ash. And that morning the fire had broken through. How did a woman so invisible dare turn breakfast into nightmare? The answer lies not just in the kitchen, but in Charleston itself in the late 1840s. A city of two faces, theaters, churches, and grand banquets on one side, chains, whips, and crowded shacks on the other. It was this soil that shaped Rebecca Turner, until one morning she transformed the hearth into her weapon. In 1849, Charleston was celebrated as the jewel of the South. For travelers from the North or from Europe, the city was proof of prosperity: straight cobblestone streets, stately red brick mansions along the Ashley River, the steady toll of church bells and magnolia gardens heavy with fragrance. But that brilliance was only half the truth. Charleston was, in reality, a city with two faces, one dazzling in light, the other drowned in shadow. On Broad Street, merchants in velvet coats and pocket watches lingered in cafes, debating cotton prices, rice shipments, and new investments. Carriages rattled past, carrying ladies in wide silk gowns, feathered hats, and delicate fans hiding their giggles. At night, King Street glowed with oil lamps, its shop windows filled with European crystal and silver. The Charleston Theater resounded with Italian opera, audiences packed tight, clapping thunderously. Banquets spilled from one night to the next, wine poured without end, violins sighing in accompaniment. For the slave-holding elite, Charleston was paradise. They dined lavishly, dressed extravagantly, and flaunted their civilization as proof of a perfect social order. Yet less than a mile from the city center, the picture darkened. Shacks of rotting wood sagged under leaking roofs, floors nothing but mud. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs ran barefoot over cracked earth. Adults bent under the sun in cane and cotton fields, their bodies crisscrossed with whip scars. By day, they stooped bare-shouldered beneath blistering skies. By night, in unlit cabins, they whispered stories of loved ones sold away, of the dead lost at sea, of children who would never see their parents again. In Charleston, a single wall could divide two soundscapes. On one side, violins soaring, on the other, chains rattling. One city, two worlds. And in between them, the kitchen stood as a strange crossroads, a place where enslaved people prepared food for the master's table, while secretly nurturing thoughts of vengeance. If Charleston were a cake, the shining frosting would be the master class's luxury. But the filling, the scorched, bitter core, was the lives of thousands of enslaved people. And, ironically, without that burnt center, the cake would never exist to show off. Rebecca Turner was born and raised inside that two-faced city. By day, she stood in the Holloway kitchen, surrounded by polished silver butter and wine. By night, she returned to a damp shack, breathing mildew, hearing children wail from hunger, hearing men groan from the lash. The Holloway kitchen was a bizarre bridge, one hand seasoning her master's meals, the other tending her brother's wounds with secret leaves and roots. For Rebecca, every dish she cooked was both humiliation and opportunity, an opening to observe, to memorize, to turn the kitchen into a vault of power. And in this divided city, tensions simmered. White Charleston basked in its flourishing civilization, while enslaved Charleston traded stories of resistance in the dark. Some whispered about uprisings that had failed. Others spoke of cooks who had once slipped special seasoning into a master's soup. Each story was like a glowing ember, waiting for the moment to ignite. To understand how Rebecca could strike the match, we must return to her childhood. Those years spent beside her mother at the hearth, where the scent of healing leaves mingled with lullabies, planting inside her a seed both tender and dangerous, the seed of memory and revenge. Rebecca Turner was born in 1823 on a sweltering Charleston summer night. Her first cry did not echo in a silk-draped parlor, but in the stifling heat of the Holloway Mansion's kitchen, amid the smell of burning wood and frying grease. The place of her birth determined her fate, a child bound to the fire, not the feast. Her mother, Miriam, was the Holloway family's head cook. Her hands were roughened by flames, but her eyes carried warmth. Miriam taught Rebecca everything she knew: how to distinguish basil from thyme by scent, how to keep a soup simmering without boiling over, and even how to use bark to staunch a wound. At night, when the fire died down, Miriam sat beside her daughter and told half-remembered stories of a distant homeland, green fields, gentle rivers, and women who sang lullabies as they cooked. To Rebecca, those stories were windows into another world, one where fire meant family, not chains. If her mother was the hearth's warmth, her father was the looming shadow. That man was Thomas Holloway, master of the estate. He never acknowledged the daughter who carried his blood. To him, Rebecca was nothing more than a kitchen slave. Many times Rebecca watched him stride past the kitchen, his gaze sliding over her as though she were no more significant than an old chair. That indifference, the denial of her very existence, cut deeper than any whip. What wound could be harsher than a father who stood before her, yet behaved as if she had never been born. Rebecca grew up in the kitchen. For others, it was a place of meals. For her, it was a school. The jars of spices were her books, the flames, her lessons, her mother's whispered tales, her history. Whenever Miriam pointed to a leaf, Rebecca remembered, this one soothes fever. That one twists the stomach in agony. These tiny seeds can put a body to sleep for a whole day. Rebecca did not yet understand it all, but she sensed that this knowledge was treasure, hidden, dangerous, and destined to be used one day. Once at 7 years old, Rebecca carried a tray of warm bread into the parlor. A guest glanced at her and laughed cruelly. "This little one looks so much like the master, doesn't she?" The room fell silent. Thomas brushed it off with a cold laugh. "Just a servant girl." "Pay it no mind," Rebecca heard every word. The tray shook in her hands, but she bit her lip and swallowed her tears. From that moment she understood. She was born denied, and that humiliation would never leave her. Children, they say, grow on their mother's milk. Rebecca grew on the smell of smoke, of scorched fat, and the sting of rejection. If there were a prize for Charleston's best child at enduring, she would have claimed it without rival. Each night Rebecca sat by the fire's glow, her young face lit by the flickering flames. Miriam would whisper, "Remember, child, within every leaf lies both life and death. It depends on the hand that wields it." The girl nodded, dark eyes gleaming in the firelight. That lesson was a seed sown deep in her heart, waiting to sprout. But seeds do not grow on words alone. They require fertilizer made of pain. And pain came early, when Rebecca's younger brother Daniel was beaten, crippled simply for plucking a peach. That night, as the fire hissed in the stove, Rebecca no longer saw the kitchen as a place of food. To her, it became the forge of a vow of vengeance. If Rebecca's childhood had been a smoldering ember in the kitchen fire, then the beating of her younger brother was the strike that turned that ember into a raging flame of hatred. It was the summer of 1830. Rebecca had just turned 7. Daniel, her little brother, 3 years younger, was barely tall enough to reach the peach tree behind the yard. On that sweltering noon, the sun poured fire onto the red-tiled roofs, cicadas shrilled endlessly, and everything seemed to urge a thirsty child toward sweetness. Daniel's eyes fixed on the ripened peaches, their skin glowing pink, their fragrance heavy in the air. He reached up and plucked one, his face lighting with the simple joy only a child could know. But that joy lasted less than a minute. A white overseer saw him. The whip cracked through the air. Daniel was dragged into the yard, the peach slipping from his small hand, rolling into the grass. Rebecca stood frozen behind the kitchen door, her wide eyes watching every lash fall on her brother's back. 20 lashes, a number cold and merciless for such a small act. Each strike split the boy's tender skin, painting red stripes across his back. Daniel screamed, his body convulsing, but his tiny fist still clutched the crushed peach, as if defying them by refusing to let it go. Rebecca wanted to run out, to scream, but her mother Miriam pulled her tight against her chest and whispered, trembling, "Don't. If you go out there, they'll kill you too." So Rebecca could only watch, her eyes wide, taking in every detail, the overseer's grunt, the whip's hiss, the way her brother writhed on the ground. The scene carved itself into her memory, searing deeper than the lash into his skin. Daniel survived, but his back was branded with scars for life. Each time he changed his shirt, Rebecca saw the ridges of flesh, purple and raised, an eternal reminder. The boy, once joyful over a peach, now sat in silence for hours, drawing aimlessly in the dirt with a stick, no longer laughing. That night, after Daniel fell asleep in their mother's arms, Rebecca sat alone by the fire. The flames cast her small shadow tall against the wall, but her eyes had aged decades in an instant. She whispered, "One day they will pay. Not with whips, but with something they'll never expect." Her small hand gripped the wooden spoon like it was a sword. In that moment, the kitchen ceased to be a place of meals. It became a forge for a vow. They say children remember punishment, so they won't repeat their mistakes. Rebecca remembered too, but not to obey. She remembered the stench of blood mingled with smoke, so that one day she could use the fire of the kitchen to teach the masters their own lesson in cruelty. After that day, Rebecca changed. She no longer learned cooking merely to please her mother. She watched carefully. She memorized who favored which dish, who often complained of stomach pains, who never finished their wine. When sent to gather herbs, she plucked not only those safe to eat, but tucked away others with darker effects. She never used them. Yet, she only stored them, piece by piece, like fragments of a puzzle of vengeance slowly forming. Daniel grew into a boy with a back full of scars, a shadow of his former self. Each time Rebecca looked at him, it was as if he were whispering, "They stole my childhood, and they are stealing yours." Without that beating, perhaps Rebecca would have lived as another silent woman, bowed forever. But Daniel's suffering taught her, silence only brings more lashes, and if she would not live on her knees, she would have to find another way. So Rebecca entered girlhood with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw just fire for cooking, but fire as opportunity. It was then she rose from apprentice to the right hand of the kitchen, her turning point, where skill and hatred began to fuse into one invisible weapon. Rebecca Turner did not step into girlhood the way other young women did. While white girls her age wore flared dresses and learned to dance beneath chandeliers, Rebecca wore a faded apron and learned how to keep the kitchen fire steady, not too strong to waste wood, not too weak to dull the flavor of the stew. At 13, she officially became her mother Miriam's little assistant. Her tasks weren't to polish her looks, but to scrub vegetables, haul firewood, and carry iron pots twice her size. Her young hands hardened, her fingers blistered and scarred. But Rebecca never complained. Each burn was a lesson. Each cut on her finger taught her to hold the knife firmer. Miriam watched her daughter with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that this kitchen, the smoke, the fire, the grease, would be the only school life had to offer her child. Rebecca also trained herself in another discipline, observation. Mistress Eleanor always wanted extra sugar in her tea. James often pushed away the roast meat, muttering it was too greasy. A visiting guest had a mild allergy to shrimp, yet never resisted the seafood soup. Rebecca remembered it all. To others, these details meant nothing. To her, they were maps of mortality. Once, Miriam asked, "Why do you bother noticing such little things?" Rebecca answered simply, "You told me spices decide the taste. I think they can decide more than that." Miriam froze but did not scold her. She knew her daughter was beginning to see truths she herself had always hidden. In the evenings, when the enslaved gathered in the yard, whispers spread about cooks on other plantations who had added a special spice that sent their masters to the grave. Some tales were true, others only rumor. But Rebecca listened silently, collecting each story like seeds. One day, she thought, perhaps she would write her own tale to be retold in such whispers. By 16, she carried the kitchen on her shoulders. Miriam's health declined, and Rebecca became the right hand of the household's meals. No longer called the helper girl, she was the young cook. Strangely, while others flinched beneath the overseer's gaze, Rebecca remained calm. She bowed, she answered softly, but behind her smoke-veiled eyes was a steel edge they never saw. That calm invisibility was her greatest weapon. Most 16-year-old girls dreamed of first love or grand balls. Rebecca dreamed of testing how many seeds from a wild plant it would take to twist a strong stomach into knots. If there had been a prize for most practical girl in Charleston, she would have won without contest. Her girlhood molded her into something different, skilled with the pan, sharp in thought. She realized the kitchen was not merely a place of service. It was a chamber of invisible power. A ladle could bring praise. It could also deliver judgment. A spice jar could add flavor, or it could add death, and it was her hands that would decide. At 17, Miriam's illness deepened. On her deathbed, she clasped her daughter's hand and whispered, "My child, I have lived my life in this kitchen, but you are different. You can turn it into the weapon I never dared to wield. Just remember, fire can warm, but it can also burn." Rebecca did not weep. She nodded, her eyes catching the firelight, as though accepting an inheritance invisible yet heavy. knowledge and memory. From that day, she was the cook of the Holloway estate, yet alongside the savory dishes she served, she began tending another recipe, the recipe of vengeance. And the boiling point, the moment that would force her hand, would come when her brother Daniel was traded away as collateral for Thomas Holloway's debts. Rebecca's years of silent endurance finally found their breaking point the moment Thomas Holloway, her master, her father, yet never her family, spoke of selling Daniel as though he were a sack of grain. By 1848, Daniel was no longer the fragile boy clutching a crushed peach. He was a young man, broad-shouldered, though bent by scars. Every welt on his back was a reminder of what had been stolen from him: childhood, dignity, peace. Rebecca had learned to swallow her rage, to turn it into discipline. But the thought of Daniel being sold to Louisiana, the sugarcane inferno where men's lives burned out in less than 5 years, ignited something different. This was no longer about memory, it was about preservation. That night, the kitchen fire painted her face in shifting shades of red and shadow. She gripped the wooden ladle until her knuckles whitened, until she felt the wood strain against her trembling hand. And then, through clenched teeth, she whispered to the flames, "If they count my brother as money, then I will turn their meals into graves. If they trade blood for debt, then I will trade their blood for justice." Her vow did not echo like thunder. It seeped into the bricks, into the smoke, into the iron pots that had listened to every groan of her life. From that night forward, Rebecca's watchful eyes sharpened into calculation. She knew Thomas's tongue hated bitterness. His coffee was always sweetened, masked from the truth. She knew Eleanor's tea was laced with honey, her delicate rituals performed as though sugar could soften her silence. She knew James's comfort was a bowl of oat porridge each morning, the boy's vanity paired with childish appetite. These were not details anymore. They were entry points, cracks in the armor of those who thought themselves untouchable. The Holloway household had always treated the kitchen as invisible, a place that existed only to feed them. But Rebecca saw it differently. It was a courtroom. The table would be the judge's bench, the cups and bowls the gavels. And she, the cook, the shadow, the discarded daughter, would be both prosecutor and executioner. For most, family meant shelter, belonging, blood. For Rebecca, family was proof of betrayal. Her father's house was nothing but a pawnshop of flesh, where affection could be sold off for the price of a good harvest. If Charleston's philosophers had dared to speak the truth, they would have written, "In the house of a master, kinship is worth only as much as a season of sugarcane." That night, Rebecca touched Daniel's scarred back as he slept. Her hand trembled, but her eyes were steel. The firelight flickered over her face as she swore silently, "You will not die in Louisiana. If death must come, it will not be yours. It will be theirs." Thus the kitchen ceased to be a prison. It became a workshop, a forge of vengeance. Every pinch of salt, every dried leaf, every hidden vial of bitter root was another brick in a secret architecture. Rebecca had named her future already. It was not just a meal, it was a reckoning. And when it came, Charleston would remember it not as breakfast, but as the historic morning feast. Rebecca Turner did not act out of a sudden burst of anger. After years of silence, she had learned one lesson. Patience was the sharpest knife. And from the moment she heard Daniel would be sold away, she began sharpening that knife. With leaves, with jars of spices, with every eating habit she knew as well as the lines on her own hand. By day, the kitchen sounded as it always did. The chop of knives, the clang of ladles, the scent of onions sizzling in fat. But at night, when the house was asleep, Rebecca turned the kitchen into a silent laboratory. She ground dried leaves into powder, dropped pinches into water, watching for changes in color. Some nights she tested a few drops on scraps of meat, leaving them until morning to see how the flesh changed. Other nights she spent hours weighing tiny grains of poison, like a chemist working out formulas. To others, it might have seemed strange. To Rebecca, it was preparation for a trial where the kitchen itself would be the courtroom, and she the judge. Rebecca did not kill recklessly. She wanted each death to bear a personal mark, as if the dining table were transformed into a charge sheet for each one of them. Thomas Holloway, the aging master who loved his coffee sweet, Rebecca chose to mix oleander powder into the sugar, so he would drink poison hidden in the very sweetness he craved. Eleanor, the wife who always sipped peppermint tea with honey. Rebecca spent weeks finding the perfect way to dissolve the poison without altering the flavor. James, the young heir who lived on oatmeal each morning. Rebecca ground the leaves into a fine powder, stirred them into his porridge, ensuring he would finish every last spoonful without suspicion. It was more than a breakfast. It was three separate verdicts written in their own favorite flavors. Night after night, Rebecca sat alone at the hearth. She laid out leaves, powders, and jars like sacred offerings. Every movement was deliberate, ritual-like, grinding leaves in a stone mortar, the rasp echoing through the dark, sifting powder through cloth, each grain falling like sand through an hourglass, packing small doses, ready to be slipped into food unseen the next morning. And with each step, she whispered a prayer. For Daniel, for Mother, for all who died in silence. People often said, a good cook keeps her recipes secret. Rebecca was surely Charleston's finest cook, for her secret was not written in any cookbook, but sealed inside jars no one dared to open. The terrifying part was not that she trembled. On the contrary, she was unnervingly calm. When chopping onions, not a tear fell. When tasting a dish, her lips curved into the faintest hollow smile. Once, Daniel caught her grinding leaves late into the night. He asked, "What are you doing?" Rebecca laid a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Cooking a meal. They will never forget." Daniel did not fully understand, but the look in her eyes silenced him. Rebecca never wrote the plan down. She kept it in memory, the one thing no one could take from her. But in her heart, she gave it a name, the historic breakfast. Not because it mattered to the Holloways, but because it would prove that fire could do more than feed. It could destroy. On the night before June 12th, 1849, Rebecca stayed by the fire until late. She stared at the pot of soup bubbling over the flames, but her thoughts were not on the food. Instead, she saw the faces of her mother, of Daniel, and of herself. A child denied, a girl raised in smoke, a woman at the edge of endurance. She whispered softly, "Tomorrow this kitchen will not cook breakfast. Tomorrow this kitchen will cook justice." And as dawn broke, the church bells rang to welcome a new day. In the grand dining room, Thomas, Eleanor, and James sat down, unaware they awaited the last meal of their lives. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Rebecca calmly carried the tray, her eyes gleaming through the haze of smoke. The historic breakfast had begun. On June 12th, 1849, Charleston awoke to the sound of church bells and sunlit streets. To most, it was an ordinary day. But inside the Holloway estate, a breakfast was being served, one that would be etched into history as an invisible trial. Sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, glinting off polished silverware. The table was dressed in pristine white linen, crystal glasses filled with orange juice. The aroma of coffee drifted, mint tea laced with honey gave off a sweet note, and a steaming bowl of oatmeal sent up curls of vapor. At the head of the table sat Thomas Holloway, crisp in a white shirt, reading his morning paper. To his right, Eleanor delicately raised a teacup, her gold ring catching the light. To his left, James, just 22, yawned, his hair tousled, eyes brightening at the sight of his favorite porridge. Behind them stood Rebecca Turner, quiet in her worn apron. No one looked at her for long. They had grown accustomed to seeing her as nothing more than a shadow in the kitchen. Yet that very shadow now held the noose above their heads. Thomas lifted his coffee, took a sip, and frowned. "Why does this taste a bit bitter today?" Rebecca bowed slightly, voice soft. "Perhaps it's the new sugar, sir." He shrugged, drank again. Within the sweetness, powdered oleander was already sliding into his bloodstream, its silent promise to quicken his heart until it failed. Eleanor stirred her tea with a silver spoon, tasted, and wrinkled her nose. "There's something unusual in the flavor." Rebecca replied evenly, "The honey this season is rather strong." Eleanor dismissed the thought. To her, a cook was only a servant, never clever enough to deceive. Sip by sip, the poison mingled with her pulse. James, carefree, dug into his oatmeal, blowing across the spoon before shoveling it in. Mother, it's smoother than usual today. Rebecca's eyes darkened. Inside that bowl, powdered leaves had been ground so fine they blended seamlessly, undetectable. At first, the effects came slowly. Thomas set down his paper, his hand trembling. Eleanor dropped her spoon, clutching her stomach. James paused mid-bite, brow furrowed. Then the storm broke. Thomas clutched his chest, gasping, eyes rolling back. Eleanor groaned, toppling sideways, her hand striking the table hard. James convulsed, retching, porridge mixed with blood spilling from his mouth. The grand dining room filled with the crash of silverware, the shatter of glass, the tearing of screams. The white cloth bloomed with stains of wine and blood. In the chaos, Rebecca did not move. She stood tall, eyes steady, wooden ladle clutched like a gavel. Every scream, every strangled breath was another line written into the verdict. Thomas collapsed forward, still gripping his newspaper. Eleanor slumped in her chair, her teacup shattered at her side. James crawled, reaching for air, body trembling violently before falling still. Within an hour, the Holloway family, who had believed themselves untouchable, lay dead at their own table. They say breakfast is the most important meal of the day. For the Holloways, it was true, only it was also their last. If Charleston ever gave an award for most memorable breakfast, theirs would have won, posthumously. Outside, Charleston bustled in its morning calm. But within the Holloway dining room, the hearth had become an execution ground. No jury, no judge. Only a quiet cook, a pinch of oleander, and a vow never forgotten. Rebecca gazed around the room and exhaled, whispering as if to her mother and brother, "Justice has been served." But killing was only half the battle. Survival and shaping the story was another. Rebecca knew exposure meant the gallows. And so, after that fatal morning, she began a new performance. Feigned panic, a tale of food poisoning, and a message of resistance hidden beneath the mask. The death of the Holloway family should have marked the end of Rebecca Turner. In Charleston, 1849, a single accusation of "the cook poisoned them" would have been enough to drag her to the square and end her life on the gallows. But Rebecca would not let the fire die so quickly. She understood. An act of vengeance fades unless it is turned into a story others can continue to tell. The moment Thomas collapsed onto the table, Eleanor convulsed in her chair, and James crawled across the floor, Rebecca let out a piercing scream. It split the air, sharp and shrill, bringing the household servants rushing into the dining room. "Mistress! Master! My God, what's happening?" Rebecca feigned panic, clutching her head, running about like a bird with broken wings. She cried again and again, "It wasn't me! It wasn't me! It must be spoiled food! Oh, Lord, why has this happened?" The servants, stunned, saw the old cook just as frantic as they were. In that first moment, no one thought to point a finger. That very day, Rebecca spun a plausible explanation. Thomas, with his weak stomach, had often complained coffee upset him. Eleanor was prone to headaches, fainting easily in summer heat. James ate too much hot porridge, which could have caused cramps. She wove it all together, adding the seasoning of hysteria into a narrative of food poisoning. It was believable enough for the crowd to repeat, and vague enough that no one dared assert the truth. At the same time, Rebecca worked through the slave's hidden network to send her real message. She slipped coated scraps into loaves bound for the market, tucked symbolic herbs into baskets. Each sign could only be read by her own community. Rebecca has struck. The kitchen is a weapon. In the cabins, whispers spread faster than fire. The Holloways are dead, all of them, at breakfast. Who did it? Someone in the kitchen. One of us. The answer, passed in whispers, quickly became legend. The slaveholders panicked. Their dining tables, once sanctuaries of comfort, were now places of suspicion. Men peered into their wine glasses, interrogated servants about ingredients. Some replaced their cooks the very next day, but the fear lingered. For the enslaved, it was the first proof that resistance did not need swords or guns. A spoonful of soup, a cup of tea, a pinch of leaf, enough to topple a household. If there were ever a master's guide to healthy living, It would now include a chapter: never fully trust your cook. And yet the cruel irony was, they had no choice. Without their cooks, they could not live a day. Rebecca had planted that bitter irony at every elegant table. As the city murmured, Rebecca remained calm. She kept cooking for the next meals as though nothing had happened. When someone eyed her with suspicion, she only gave a faint, cool smile. Food can spoil, but I have never let my spirit spoil. The cryptic words sounded to some like philosophy, to others like evasion. But everyone who heard them had to think twice. Rebecca knew, if the story ended as an accidental poisoning, it would fade into oblivion. So she deliberately seeded fragments for the cabins to repeat that she had not simply cooked food, she had cooked justice. At night, some looked up at the sky and said, Rebecca didn't just feed them. She fed us hope. From a single poisoning, the tale became a spreading flame. And once a flame is lit, it no longer belongs to the one who struck the match. It began to blaze across Charleston, planting terror in the hearts of masters and hope in the hearts of the enslaved. The next step was no longer concealment, but facing the aftershock, shaking the entire city. After that poisoned morning in the Holloway mansion, Charleston was never the same. If an ordinary storm left behind shattered tiles and fallen trees, the storm called Rebecca Turner left something far more devastating: suspicion. Once the dining table had been the safest place, slaveholders sat down, confident that everything had been carefully prepared by the cook. But after the Holloway family's deaths, that sense of safety vanished. In wealthy mansions, the familiar scene now carried a strange new detail. Masters glaring at their soup bowls as if at enemies, sipping wine with sweat on their foreheads, some even demanding that food be tasted first. What began as a small precaution turned into an unspoken law. One lady whispered to her friend, "It feels like living beside a ticking bomb. Who can say what's hidden in the porridge?" Luxury itself became stained with doubt. And that fear, that lingering poison of mistrust, was the sweetest victory Rebecca had left behind. Meanwhile, in the ramshackle cabins, news of the Holloway family's death spread like wind. Yet it was not whispered in fear. It was spoken with eyes lit by hope. A man said, "They died in their own meal. No whip, no gun, just a handful of leaves. That means we can do it too." A mother rocked her child, not with a lullaby, but with a story. There was a woman who cooked justice in a pot of soup, and you must remember her name. Rebecca Turner became a tale retold at every fire pit, in every meager supper. The death of the Holloway family should have been the end of Rebecca Turner. In Charleston, 1849, a mere whisper of "the cook poisoned them" was enough to drag her to the gallows. But Rebecca refused to let the fire die so quickly. She understood revenge without a story would vanish. Revenge turned into legend would endure. News did not stop at Charleston. It leapt to neighboring plantations, then across South Carolina. Every rumor of a family struck by a strange illness was tied back to Rebecca. Even unrelated deaths were branded as her hand. Rebecca no longer needed to act. The fear and hope lived on without her. Rumor became her strongest ally. The same story sowed two opposite emotions. For the masters, fear, sleepless nights, suspicion of even their closest servants. For the enslaved, hope, the belief that an invisible weapon was finally within reach. One event, two reflections, like a mirror showing both horror and possibility. If there had been a survival handbook for slaveholders, a new chapter would have read, "Never leave the cook alone in the kitchen. Always taste the food first, or make a guest taste it. Above all, never mistake silence for obedience." Meanwhile, Rebecca carried on as if nothing had happened. She cooked, swept, chopped vegetables. Her calmness deepened the mystery. No one knew if she truly struck, but everyone believed she had. Rebecca turned ambiguity itself into power. The aftershocks outlived the Holloways. Years later, Rebecca was remembered as one of the first to turn a kitchen into a weapon of resistance. From her story, other flames were kindled, small sparks feeding a larger fire that would one day be called revolution. The Holloway's end did not bury their name. it carved another into history. Rebecca Turner. Slaveholders scrambled for safety measures. Cooks were forced to taste every dish before serving. Overseers were stationed in kitchens. Some even imported European chefs believing foreigners were more loyal. Yet these were nothing but rusty locks on rotting doors. Fear still seeped into every meal. In the slave cabins, her name became a password, a signal. It wasn't spoken aloud, but in a glance everyone knew. Mothers rocked their children, whispering, "There was once a woman who cooked justice in a pot of soup. She did what thousands only dreamed." Children's eyes widened. To them, Rebecca was proof that even in the darkest corner, a fire could be lit. The story traveled further, through merchants, ports, and churches, into Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana. Where fine dinners were laid, whispers followed. "Be careful, Rebecca Turner might still be out there." And where slave cabins stood, hope answered back, "If she could do it, so can we." Rebecca became a symbol not just of one city, but of an entire land. The irony, Rebecca never left her kitchen. Yet from that narrow space, she traveled everywhere, in imagination, in fear, in hope. They could chain her body, but not the story that spread. Years later, Margaret Holloway, Thomas's abolitionist sister, returned from the North. Learning of her brother's death, she did not curse Rebecca. Instead, she quietly bought her freedom. Under Margaret's protection, Rebecca was reborn. No longer cooking for those who treated her as a tool, she used the kitchen to pass on knowledge. Herbs for healing, tricks for survival, ways to season justice if the time came. Rebecca did not live to see the Civil War, but before her death, she passed down her memory to the next generation. Around the fire, she told the children, "The kitchen is not only for food, it is for memory, and memory is stronger than the whip, stronger than the chain." When war erupted decades later, Black soldiers and camp women still carried her name in their songs. Rebecca Turner lived on, not as a woman, but as a symbol. Today in Charleston's old kitchens, some say the walls still carry the smell of smoke, and faint knocks of a wooden spoon can be heard. Not a haunting, but a reminder. Once the kitchen was a courtroom, and silence became a verdict. History is said to be written on the banquet tables of victors. Rebecca Turner proved it could also be written on the breakfast table of the defeated. Rebecca Turner has no grave, no statue, but her legacy endures in something stronger than stone, the shift in memory. She planted fear in the oppressors' hearts and hope in the enslaved. And every time oil crackles in a pot in Charleston, someone shivers. Not from the heat, but from remembering the woman who turned a single breakfast into the overture of a revolution. That fire, lit in 1849, has never gone out.